All right, so we are back again with another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. I am John, and this is Maddie.
Hi, I'm Maddie.
There you go. For those who missed last episode we talked about autistic attitudes towards LGBT inclusion and general sex differences between autistic men and autistic women. And so to continue the streak of controversial topics around sex and gender, we thought we would tackle both abortion and women's ordination in this episode. So if those
Yay.
are not topics you want to hear about, probably tune out.
Those are
Yeah,
the only
so
two.
yeah, those are the only two we'll be discussing this episode, but don't worry, your other questions about sexuality will be answered in future episodes.
We'll
Maybe,
be
who
back
knows?
with even worse
Yes.
topics later.
Yes, we will be back with human horrors beyond your comprehension in further episodes. I'm joking, but surging forward. So in this episode, we're going to answer a few questions. So questions that I got a lot were autistic attitudes towards women's ordination. So I mentioned this in a podcast, in the main podcast, that this often comes up as an issue where autistic people cite women's ordination as a big deal for them, either joining a denomination or with their friction with denominations and things like that. And so people were asking me why. Various questions about autistic attitudes towards women in leadership in general and women's education and things like that. And also people saying, I don't support women's ordination and I'm autistic. Am I valid?
Am I real?
Yeah, things like that. And then other questions like, hey, what do autistic people think about abortion? And how can autistic people be so logical and well-informed and still be pro-choice or pro-life or some other combination of the thing? Or, I saw these autistic people and they're all pro whatever position you don't like. How can they be so smart and yet so dumb? And I'm going to try to answer those questions. And like last episode, I hold whatever opinions you hold on all these issues. So
Yes.
don't email me telling me that you disagree with me, because I hold your position. And
Unless
so
you're
does
Jehovah's
Maddie.
Witness.
What did you say?
I said unless you're Jehovah's Witness. We
Yes.
took a stance on them last time.
Yes, unless you are Jehovah's Witness. I also got recently asked about my data on Mormons. I'll quickly knock that one out of the park. I don't take data on Mormons because I don't consider them Christian for the sake of this research. I only consider a denomination to be Christian if they are mutually understood to be Christian by other Christians. For example, Catholics and Orthodox will look at Baptists and say these people are in error, but they are still Christian. And Baptists, mostly, will look at Catholics and say these people are still Christian, but they're in error. Whereas there are very few Christian groups, except for the most liberal of Christian groups, that would look at Mormons and say these people are also Christians. So while I have interviewed many Mormons, just out of my own curiosity, I quickly realized that Mormons were very different from Christians and had many different things going on with them. I'll just say that I did not feel qualified to tackle, and that I thought a Mormon who actually knows this territory would be much better suited to deal with. There are many cultural similarities between Mormons and like conservative evangelical Christians. And so to the extent that those Venn diagrams overlap, you will probably find the same phenomena with autistic people. But yeah, anyway, so that was your Mormon diversion for this episode.
Yeah,
Back to the planned topic.
You should take this out, but I get in trouble a lot for saying Baptists aren't Christians.
That part's staying in.
You've got a sample size of one. There you go.
Yes. When you become the female pope, then they'll implement your directive.
Speaking of women's ordination.
Yeah, speaking of female pope, let's talk about women's ordination and the various autistic attitudes towards women in leadership. So we're going to cover 4 categories. So we're going to cover women's ordination, women in higher education, women in non-ordained leadership, and women in ministry. So before we start, I'll just say the best determination for what an autistic person believes about any of these issues is to look at their denomination and then to look at their political orientation within that denomination. If you look at those two things, you can probably guess what positions they're going to hold beforehand. So it's not looking at if they're autistic, it's looking at what denomination do they belong to and what's their political orientation within that denomination. If you can get those two factors right, you could probably get most of the views that they'll hold. In general, women are much more likely to be affirming across all categories than men, and the gaps tend not to be very significant. Usually where the gaps are greatest is around 20%, where the gaps are smallest down to 3% in some cases. But overall, there is high support for women's ordination within autistics. And this is for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons that we will probably be saying a lot this episode is the 3-word sentence, default, meritocratic, egalitarian. So that is the sort of de facto position that most autistic people will hold. So what that means is that most autistic people, when they're trying to make decisions, will default back to a position of meritocratic egalitarianism. So that is to say that what determines whether or not you are qualified for leadership is your competence and your suitability for that leadership role. And then egalitarian means that they generally do not think that gender should be a factor that is considered in determining merit or suitability. And so for most positions in most things, just across the board, autistic people will be default meritocratic egalitarian, meaning that if you ask an autistic person, should this person be allowed to do X, where X is pretty much anything, the question you will get is not about their gender, but is about their qualifications and experience, and whether or not those qualifications and experience enable them to do that job. And women's ordination is no real difference. There's also an effect that we talked about in the main podcast called the 1% principle, and the way it applies to women's ordination. The way it applies is you sort of have to decide whether you're going to be default closed or default open. So what I mean by that is default closed would mean you say everything should be restricted unless we have 100% certainty that it shouldn't be restricted, versus things should not be restricted unless we have 100% certainty that they should be restricted. Generally speaking, most autistic people are default open rather than default closed. So they think that restrictions should not be imposed unless we have really good reasons to impose them. And so another big factor that you often get when you talk to autistic people and you ask them about women's ordination is, even if they don't think it should be a thing, in general, they'll often be very hesitant and cagey about it because they're like, well, maybe there's a case that could be made for it. And if there could be a case, then, I don't want to say no. And you get that sort of cagey, hesitant response because of the 1% principle. So keep those two things in mind when we're talking about this. So when you ask the question, should women be allowed to be clergy? Generally speaking, the majority of autistic men and the majority of autistic women will be pro-women's ordination. This is a slim majority, so this is probably around 60% of them. And the vast majority of those are within Protestant denominations. Obviously, they're within Protestant denominations because the Catholics and the Orthodox aren't super big into that. That being said, you will still find autistic Catholics and autistic Orthodox who are pro-women's ordination within those denominations. Generally speaking, a really big factor for determining whether or not an autistic person will be pro-women's ordination is if they belong in a denomination that's pro-women's ordination. So in denominations that allow women's ordination, you'll get around 98% of autistic women who will agree. It's very rare. Sometimes you do find, though, women in denominations that are explicitly affirming, that say, I don't think women should be ordained. They're rare. I have met them, though. And around 80% of autistic men within those denominations will also be pro women's ordination. So the crushing majority of women and a large majority of men. In denominations where there are mixed opinions, or in denominations where it is left up to the diocese to decide whether or not you should have women's ordination, it'll be around 90% of women in that category that agree, and it will be around 70% of autistic men that would agree with it. So if you look at ACNA or ACNA, is it ACNA or is it ACNA? I don't know. I'm not a
Everyone
church.
I know says ACNA, and I go to an ACNA church.
Okay, there you go. So in the ACNA has a mixed orientation towards this, where it's
Yeah.
basically up to your diocese to decide whether or not it will do women's ordination. And so if you go by diocese, it does change. So if you're in a diocese where it does support women's ordination, they will generally also support women's ordination. But if you're in one that doesn't, you're less likely. However, usually if there is a possibility for it and it's just by diocese, still 90% of women will be supportive of it, and 70% of autistic men will be supportive of it. In denominations where ordination is not allowed for women, around 35% of autistic women will still be pro women's ordination within those denominations, and around 20% of men will. What did
Yeah.
you say?
I said that's pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, you autistic women and having strong dissenting positions on the role of women, like handshake meme.
Yeah. And we agree with you if you do. And we agree with you if
Yes,
you don't.
that's the important thing to remember, is that when it comes to women's ordination, we hold your position on
Yeah.
women's ordination. So don't email me telling me that my position is wrong, because I hold your position. When it comes to questions about women's education, especially women's higher education, denomination here does not have a serious impact. And the biggest factor that I found is age. Basically, the older people are less likely to support women in higher education. So that's like women getting PhDs, women getting education in general. For autistic women, it's 99% that if you ask the question, should women be allowed to pursue higher education in university? It's like 99% of women who think that should be the case. I don't know personally any women who don't think that women should be allowed to go to university. And it's around 96% of men, which is to say, there are some, they are a very small minority. If you ask the question, should women be allowed to pursue theological education? It will also be very high. So, autistic women, around 94% will say yes, and autistic men, around 88% will say yes to that question. So, for questions about women in non ordained leadership, denomination does not have a serious impact. The only real impact here, again, tends to be age. So, if you're looking at autistic people and asking them questions like, should women be allowed to be in a leadership hierarchy in which they are above men? Around 93% of autistic people will say yes, and around 85% of autistic men will say yes. So that means like a woman within like leadership or church leadership in which they are in charge of men, most autistic people are like, yeah, whatever. It's a default meritocratic egalitarian unless otherwise specified. Questions like, should women be allowed in management roles if they're not in charge of men? It goes up to 99% of women and 96% of men, where I've yet to meet a woman who doesn't hold this position, but I'm not going to say 100% just because
You're
there's
out
always room for one
there.
weirdo.
We see you.
Yes, and we hold your position, more importantly.
Yeah.
So don't email us.
We're part of that 1%.
Yes. Oh, God. Uh, yeah, so questions about should women be allowed to be in a teaching role where they are not teaching theology? and they are teaching men. Autistic women
Not
are
teaching
at
theology,
not teaching
just
theology.
teaching like something.
Yeah, so teaching math or teaching history or something like that,
Right.
or leading a seminar on, I don't know, setting up chairs. Who knows?
Women are good at that.
Yeah, they're great at leading seminars on setting up chairs. Famous, very famous for doing that. So if you look at it, it's 99% of autistic women who think it's fine and 96% of autistic men. Sport is just very high, and it's basically the question of should you be allowed to be in a teaching role is not what's your gender, it's are you competent. And
Mhm.
if you are, then you get through.
Meritocratic.
Default meritocratic egalitarian. The next question is should women be allowed to be in a teaching role in which they are teaching theology specifically to men? Should women be allowed to be professors at seminary and whatnot? And for autistic women, it's 99%. For autistic men, it's 94%. Again, very high. The question, if should a woman be allowed to teach in a seminary or something like that? The answer to that question is she qualified? And if she's qualified and a good teacher, then yeah, she should be allowed to. Gender should not be a controlling factor here. Go ahead.
Does that include Sunday school? Do we think the 6% of guys also only want men teaching Sunday school or whatever?
I don't think they consider children people. No.
Fair. I hadn't considered that.
I don't know. Yeah, so I haven't actually reported data for women teaching Sunday school just because it's pretty much the norm in every single denomination. And there
Yeah.
are very few norms in which, or there are very few denominations in which women are not allowed to teach a Sunday school or something like that or be involved in children's education.
There was apparently some Mennonites like split over the question of Sunday school because they were like, I don't know, some of them were like, you should only teach your kids inside your house. You shouldn't have someone teaching them outside the house. So they like made a
That
new branch.
that does sound like Mennonites.
That's just a fun anecdote that Seth picked up from talking to
Yeah,
Mennonites.
Mennonites, however, don't often respond to my questions about whether or not they're autistic.
They don't?
They no,
That's
they look
weird.
at you confused and being like, "What? Why are you asking me that?"
That's because
Um,
they all are, and they just don't.
yes, but they won't let me survey them to figure it out if it's true or if it just feels true. It definitely feels true. When you look at questions for women in ministry, denomination again doesn't have a serious impact. The only real factor here is again age, where the older you are, the less likely you are to support. So, should women be allowed in ministry roles where they are only teaching other women? 99% of autistic women, 97% of autistic men. You very rarely find situations in which someone will say no to that question.
I can almost guarantee that the 3% of men who say no also would not be interested in teaching anything.
Totally. And then there's the next question, which should women be allowed in a ministry role in which they're teaching both men and women? 99% of women agree, 94% of men agree. So that would be in like a lay ministry position or in a teaching role in which you are explicitly teaching church related things. And so, again, very high across the board.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that's generally speaking how it breaks down across denominations. When you ask, I mean, the next question that everyone asks is why do autistic people believe these things? And well, listener, thank you for asking that great question at your podcast. I'm responding to you. The 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 justification for these various positions is as follows. So when it comes to women's ordination, the justification for women's ordination follows a few lines. So the first one is that generally speaking, people who support women's ordination have a view of gender where they do not believe in gender essentialism, generally speaking. So gender essentialism is the idea that there is an essence to gender, or there is some sort of immutable foundational stuff that makes you a woman or makes you a man, and that these things are fixed and immutable. So overwhelmingly, if you support women's ordination, it's 70% of them would also be not would be against the idea of gender essentialism. Around 30% would hold to some form of gender essentialism.
So they'd be gender essentialists, but just not think that it matters for ordination.
Yes. So they would say, we are gender essentialists, but I also don't care if women get ordained, would be the position.
Woman is a biological thing, but being ordained is not.
Yes, that's basically what they would say. For women's ordination here, we are talking specifically about the reception of holy orders. We aren't talking about should someone be allowed to preach on a Sunday, because there are many churches in which you can preach on a Sunday and not be ordained. And
True, yeah.
so we are specifically talking about ordained ministry, whatever that means in your denomination. Typically, in denominations that have a stronger ecclesial structure, these opinions will differ, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, overwhelmingly, these people would not adhere to a sort of gender essentialist paradigm. So the justification for this is pretty straightforward. Generally speaking, autistics are meritocratic egalitarians. So long as the person can do a task, they should not be barred from it, is basically the reasoning. Autistic women specifically are often more likely to identify with various schools of feminist thought that would oppose discrimination on the basis of sex. And so often they will invoke that this is an arbitrary distinction that we've made because of patriarchy or because of sexism, that we have specifically barred women from these roles, even though they are capable of doing these roles for arbitrary reasons to do with gender. They often will have a strong belief that gender hierarchies are damaging and destructive and should be opposed on principle. And generally speaking, these people would say, look, gender hierarchies are bad, so we shouldn't have them in church leadership. Generally speaking, they have very high aversion to any form of sex discrimination. And if you bring up sex discrimination in general, they'll be like, yeah, that's not something I agree with, or that's not something I think we should do at all. And so because they generally have a very high aversion to sex-based discrimination in general, they apply those same principles to ordination. When you ask them for biblical justification or justification through church history or various things like that, which I do fairly often, they will give one of the following types of arguments. So often they will point to things like female deacons being mentioned in the Bible. So for example, Phoebe is mentioned in Romans 16:2, where Paul says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon at the church of King It's the word that they use is deacon. There's another woman in Romans named Junia who is called foremost amongst the apostles. There are various women featured throughout the New Testament and in Paul's letters where they hold some form of leadership, whether it be they run the house church or they are the head of the household in which a church meets. There are often various references to Thecla, who was an early Christian saint who did various things like preach and preach to men, and she baptizes herself at one point, and Paul recognizes it as a valid baptism. Now, Thecla is not in the Bible. Thecla is in an extra biblical source. I should be very clear about this.
You should have
But they
led
will
with
point they will point to Thecla as like a legitimate thing, and because Thecla is a legitimate thing, we should be more willing to think about this. In one source that we have outside of the Bible and outside of Christianity in general, from a man named Pliny the Younger, he's sending a letter back to Trajan, and he is asking how he's supposed to deal with Christians in this letter. And at one point, he says, I found two slave girls who were deacons in the church. and I tortured them for information. They didn't give me much though. And but what you can glean from that letter is that in the early church, women did hold a role called deacon, because there were these two slave girls that were called deacons, and Pliny has no real reason to lie about that. There's no reason he wouldn't call them deacons. And yeah, there are also deacons mentioned in various church fathers. Famously, John Chrysostom has a letter to a female deacon, things like that. There are also a lot of like gender abolitionist readings of various passages, especially in places like Paul. So the big one that most people point to is Galatians 3:28, which is to say, in Christ there is no man, there is no woman, there is no slave, there is no free, there is no Greek, there is no Jew, for all are one in Christ. And they'll read that and say, look, Paul didn't even believe in gender distinction like this. Sure, he had some basis of sex distinction that he used in various other places, but he's using that as a sort of practical, pragmatic sense, not as a theological sense. Because when he's talking about it in theological terms, he is saying there is no distinction between men and there is no distinction in Christ. There may be in the real political Roman world, but not in Christ. And they'll point to various passages like that. There are also readings of the Protestant Reformation that, because often these people are in Protestant denominations, where they will say that women's ordination is a logical consequence of the Protestant Reformation, which is good, they'll say. um, because there are also people who there are also people who argue the opposite, to say it's a logical trajectory from the Reformation, which is bad. These
Derogatory.
people will say these people will say that the Protestant Reformation sort of opens up the possibility for women's ordination and starts a trajectory that we are simply continuing to go down in the sort of semper reformandi. I think I pronounced that wrong, but the always reforming battle cry of some Protestant churches. Now, there's also another very common reading that you'll get, which is to say, look, when Christianity emerged, it emerged out of a patriarchal culture in which the paterfamilialis was the central unit of social organization. Paterfamilialis is this idea, it's like the man is at the top of the household and he is the one who governs and controls all of it. And so Christians were emerging out of that context. And so they just adopted the customs and culture of the place that they were coming out of. But there's no reason that we need to continue to adopt that idea. They'll also point to the fact that Christians have historically not been great with women. Like in many cases, women are talked about in the church fathers in very derogatory terms. They're talked about as being stupid or as being childlike or mentally feeble. And a lot of attitudes around women are not the greatest, I'll say, and are often based on assumptions about women from the culture that they're coming from. And a lot of people will say, look, we just know these things aren't true. And they didn't know these things are true because the conventional wisdom of their day taught them that they were true. The only reason we have these in here was because these men just believed false things about women. And so there's no need for us to perpetuate the same ideas. And if ancient people were capable of categorizing women as equivalents to men, we might have had ordination in the early church for women, but the reality is they didn't think like that. And so we can't actually go back to run the experiment like, how would the church have developed if it actually thought women were mentally capable and had the same types of competencies as men? And because we can't really do that, what we should be asking is what principles behind why people were chosen for ordination or why women were barred from ordination. And often when you look at the justification in the church fathers, it will basically be women are worse. And that's mostly what it comes down to. And we'll talk about arguments against affirming women's ordination in a bit, but one of the arguments that you'll typically get is one about uh, the persona Christi, and women aren't lesser; they're just different roles and things like that. But these people will point out that's not really how a lot of the church fathers reasoned about women and thought about women, and not exactly where they thought women should be in the hierarchy. If you look at Pseudo Dionysius or someone like that, who's talking about spiritual hierarchies and where people fit within spiritual hierarchies, he puts slaves and women in the lowest rung of the ladder. and the argument is, look, these are the categories they were working with, and these are what they genuinely thought women were like, and we now know that to be false. And what do you do once you realize one of your beliefs is false? Well, you update, and you update now accounting for a new true belief. And so we should basically understand that a lot of the reasoning and justification for barring women was based on what is really misogyny. And now that we know that misogyny is in fact bad, again, your opinions on this. So now that we agree that misogyny is bad, we should be fully capable of going forward with women's ordination. And yeah, that's the type of reasoning and the type of justification you'll get.
Hmm.
You'll also get arguments about, look, God's design for humanity included gender, but gender is sort of an incidental product of humanity because we sexually reproduce. There's no real reason for us to have gender, and they go down a sort of Gregory of Nyssa view of gender, where it's like gender is the result of humanity needing to sexually reproduce, not some sort of eternal truth. And when we get to heaven, we're not going to have gender because gender is only needed for sexual reproduction. And so they'll have this idea that is gender hierarchy actually needed and essential, or is gender hierarchy just something that was adopted because it made sense in these historical circumstances? Now that we're no longer living in those historical circumstances, do we need to really keep this? There are other arguments to basically say, look, the church is fallible and it makes lots of mistakes. Look at the church's positions on something like slavery for a very long time. They just got that wrong, right? But then we eventually figured out the right opinion, which is that slavery is bad and no one should do it. And then we reversed our course on that. So maybe it's time we just take a look at women in the same way that we looked at slavery before, where we say, yeah, the church did make these pronouncements, but the church was wrong, and we need to morally update where we are. And then, yeah, there's basically the other argument, or the final argument, is there is nothing special or required for ordination other than a call and competence. So what is required of ordination is that God is calling you. And if you are a woman and God is calling you to ordination, your being a woman should not prevent you from being able to fulfill God's call. And yeah, so is that basically, when you ask an autistic person why they support women's ordination, it will be some variation of all those arguments thrown
Yeah.
in.
Is that all?
Is that all? I think I got most of them. There are probably more. I'm sure there are more,
That
but
was
those
good.
are the
I
ones you
think
typically.
you filled like 15 minutes, I think, maybe with those. So that was good.
Well, I mean, I'll just say autistic people have filled far more than 15 minutes of my life explaining women's ordination to me. So you're getting back what you gave to me, is what I'll say. Now, the arguments against women's ordination are much simpler and take a lot less time to explain, mostly because being against women's ordination was sort of the position of the church for most of its history.
Yeah. So there's less taking things apart.
Yes, there is less need to justify yourself, and there is less need to explain yourself. Typically, the people who oppose women's ordination are often caricatured as misogynists who hate women. I want to emphasize that when you're talking, that I'm not talking about the whole population of Christians who oppose women's ordination. I am specifically talking about autistic people who I asked this question to, who oppose women's ordination. I have not found it to be the case that these people are misogynists. I
Yeah.
have overwhelmingly found it to be the case that these people think misogyny is bad and that you shouldn't hate women or discriminate against them. They just think that women shouldn't be allowed to be priests.
There's like a general trend with autistic people when they hold like a more conservative opinion, you would expect the usual reactionary talking points, but they tend to have actual reasons for believing things, which is nice.
Yes. Yes, that is a very big feature that I have found is autistic people don't fight in the culture war. We are all often conscientious objectors to the culture war and unwilling to fight it and unwilling to more specifically go along with some of the more reactionary elements of the culture war. The only real exceptions I've found to that are like teenage boys with like statue profile pictures or,
Not the
theologians with
statues.
laser eyes. If you have a theologian and he has laser eyes and you're a teenage autistic boy, you probably have some reactionary opinions. But if you aren't a teenage boy and have calmed down and had a few thoughts, you are typically not going to hold reactionary culture war positions.
Yeah.
And often, many of the autistics who oppose women's ordination will still be meritocratic egalitarians. They will just usually make an exception and say, but I don't think that applies to ordination because ordination is a specific thing given to us by God and it just has different rules. So, generally speaking, this is the principle I think that should apply. However, in this case, I don't think it should apply. And
Yeah.
so I just want to make it really clear, just so people hearing this don't get the wrong impression about these autistic people. They are generally speaking still relatively normal about women. I don't know how else to say that. Like,
Yeah. Fair. Yeah, I get it.
you shouldn't expect them to be raging misogynists because they are very often not.
Yeah. And they're not going to have the same arguments you would expect from a raging misogynist.
Yes. Often, so there are a few characteristics about these people. So, one of the biggest ones is that they're overwhelmingly gender essentialist. So, they believe that there is something about being a woman and something about being a man that are fixed and unchangeable. They will often have very well developed theologies of the body. They will often be like Roman Catholic in many cases,
Surprise.
or Roman Catholic adjacent. They might be Protestants who are
Who
a
really
little
wish.
delusional and think, no, I'm joking. I'm joking. I didn't say it. But they'll often be Protestants who do read a lot of Roman Catholic theologians, I found. So basically, since around 2022, 2023, when I've asked people this question, especially women, they will usually point to a book called Genesis of Gender, a Christian Theory by Abigail Favale. And yeah, that I think that's how you pronounce her name. I don't know.
I don't know how to pronounce it. I was just surprised that that was the book.
Yeah, so you will often a lot of autistic women have read it. I don't know. They mention it.
We have a
They're
secret book club. Did you know that?
what?
All the autistic women, we have a secret book club. Um,
I would not be surprised if that were the case, and I also wouldn't would be I would be surprised though that I hadn't heard about it. That's the only thing I'll say. You'll also get references to, was it Pope Benedict? Anyway, the Catholics have published like a lot of encyclicals about gender and gender roles and things like that. And yeah, so those will also often get mentioned. The general overview of these people is they believe that men and women often have different roles and different social roles. And in these social roles, there is typically a belief that women are not to be acting in the role of an ordained minister. And that's basically it. Like the justification is usually there are ordination is a specific thing, ordination is a special thing, and ordination is reserved for men. And the priest is filling a certain role, and that role is either in the persona Christi or in the tradition of the Levite priests who were only men. There are lots of different sort of justifications like that. And also, there is the justification that this is the overwhelming weight of the texts that we have in the Bible and the overwhelming weight of the witness of church history. You know, there are reasons, and the justification isn't just this is the tradition and this is why we've always done it. It's usually something about ordination is a special thing. It has specific requirements. One of those requirements just so happens to be that you need to be male. They will often be very quick to point out, we don't believe this means women are bad. We just think this means women can't be ordained. And they will often be very insistent that I understand that they don't think women are bad. They just don't think they should be allowed to be ordained. So that is typically the position that you will get. Yeah, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Cool.
They were you trying to ask which pope did like theology of the body, or did you have something else in mind?
Yes.
Oh, that was
Yes.
John Paul II.
Oh, John Paul II. There you
Yeah,
go. So that was the other thing that gets mentioned a lot. There was a pope who wrote something about stuff. I don't know, not a
he
Catholic.
wrote a whole bunch of somethings about.
Yes,
Yeah,
he wrote many things,
theology
and
is great.
specifically
Go check it out.
the Catholics have a very well developed theology of the body, and it's also cited quite heavily. Anyway, these are the justifications for being against women's ordination, and this is the justification that you will get. You will very rarely get people who are like, women's role is to be a subservient helpmeet to a man. That is rare. I will be very clear. That is a rare position. And within that position, those people will say, and because like women aren't capable of leadership and aren't capable of doing these things, they shouldn't be allowed to hold these roles. You typically only see that justification in low church Protestant denominations where they do not have a well developed ecclesiology or a high ecclesiology, and they are still against women's ordination. They have to come up, basically, ordination for them is a question of merit, and so they need to justify why women don't have merit. Again, this is a
Yikes.
very this is very rare for autistic people.
Yeah.
Typically, if an autistic person is in that denomination, they will probably leave it because that won't be their only disagreement with the
Yeah.
church, to put it lightly, and they will
You're gonna have
typically move.
some other issues.
Yeah, they'll typically move if they're still conservative. When they leave, they'll typically move to Catholicism or another high church tradition, or like a Presbyterianism, like a conservative Presbyterianism or something like that. Yeah, that is basically the against women's ordination position. Men and women have specific roles. Priesthood is a specific role designed for men. The weight of church history and church tradition. So,
That was
women
pretty.
in higher education. Oh, sorry.
I said that was pretty easy. Like we got through the.
Yep.
That was good.
Yep. Women in higher education has overwhelming support across genders with very few exceptions. There is virtually no opposition. The only real opposition is in very conservative spaces in which they do not believe women should be educated.
Right.
Basically, the reason this has happened is autistic people are overwhelmingly pro education, pro knowledge, and pro intellectual. Autistic people tend to be in families and cultures that also contain other autistics, and these environments also tend to be pro intellectual and anti intellectual because they're autistic. This is simply the nature of our people. Even amongst autistics who believe in a gender hierarchy, there's often a very strong belief that women should still be educated because education is just a very important role in social reproduction. If you want your kids to be educated and smart, and your wife is the one who is in charge of raising the kids in a lot of these situations, you want your wife to be smart.
Yeah.
And again, autistic people often will end up partnering with other autistic people, and so those autistic people value intelligence and intellectualism and things like that. And so even if they are holding to a sort of traditionalist gender paradigm, they will emphasize that they believe women's education is very important because women have a very important job, and that is social reproduction, which again requires education. There are other arguments. So, especially when you find people who autistics who are conservative but from lower socioeconomic demographics, they are often still very pro women's education because education is seen as a sort of necessary ticket for social mobility. And so, for example, I was raised in a fairly conservative social setting, but education was encouraged across the board. And it really wasn't a question whether or not we were going to university because you needed to get a good job, you needed to get a good education. And that education was either going to be in engineering or medicine. And so those were your two choices. So yeah, pick one. And so often, even amongst very conservative autists, education for women will be considered an important thing. And yeah, the anti women's education autistics tend to be young, explicitly misogynistic, autistic men with profile pictures of church reformers with laser eyes or old statues. It's very hard to tell how sincere these guys are and how much they're like if they're just memeing about it because it's like a sort of meme to hate women in those groups. And
Yeah.
so whether or not they sincerely believe that or are just joking about it, it's really hard to tell. But, you know, it is
Shout
a
out to those
thing that you
guys.
see. What do you say?
Shout out to those guys.
Yeah, shout out to those guys. We don't hold your position.
Are you memeing? We aren't sure.
Yes. People, the only, yeah. So the only other like major part where you see deviation from this is people who are in extremely conservative, high control, high demand Christian religious groups. But I want to be clear, this is a very small percentage of autistics. You almost never hear these opinions coming from any autistics, regardless of their denomination. And often when you do hear it, they're either young edgy boys who have yet to learn that they're not nearly as cool as they think they are, or very old men. Those are pretty much the only two.
Yeah.
The justification for women in non-ordained leadership, not church related teaching, is so women in management roles, women leading groups, women spearheading initiatives, women teaching in academic settings. Again, support is extremely high across the gender and political spectrum because autistics are default meritocratic egalitarians. And the attitude is if you're competent and capable, you should not be barred from doing it. You should be allowed to do it. And that gender really shouldn't be a factor that is considered. The only exceptions to these types of things would be factors in which gender actually is very important, like the support groups and rape crisis centers, things like that, women's shelters. Those are the only places where you will have the idea that only certain people of certain genders should be allowed to perform these roles. But that's more a pragmatic concern for the type of work that you're doing rather than one about qualification. Oftentimes, you will find a lot of autistics who will believe that while like sex isn't a factor that you should consider, that just if you let things go and if you let things go naturally, people will sort of naturally sex segregate along different roles and along different lines. And some jobs you'll just find more men in, and some jobs you'll find more women in, and you'll typically just find more men in leadership positions. That doesn't mean that women should be barred from those positions. It just means that generally speaking, you shouldn't expect as many women in those positions. So you'll often hear that, but those people are often like when you ask clarifying questions, they'll say, no, like in principle, I have nothing wrong with women in these positions. I just think that in general, you're not going to find as many. And yeah, that's pretty much what it's like. It's very rare. So often in more progressive circles, you'll get people who have very strong beliefs that we should have like gender parity in leadership positions. That position is very rare amongst autistic people, even amongst progressive autistic people. If you ask them, do you think we should have gender parity in all leadership positions? They'll say something like, no, the most qualified people should get the job. And that's not always going to break down along 50-50 lines, and we shouldn't try to force a 50-50 ratio. The only real exceptions to this are the autistics who hold really strongly to ideas about gender hierarchy. So they are often people who believe that gender hierarchy is good and natural and that we shouldn't try to contravene it. The other group, the laser eye theologian group, that group tends not to support women in non-ordained leadership. People from very conservative backgrounds, famously, there's a John Piper quote about how he doesn't think that women should be allowed to be police officers, or if a woman stops and asks for directions, how can the woman give the directions to the man in a way that she is not assuming authority over him? If an autistic person comes from those backgrounds, they may initially hold to some of those beliefs, but I find that those go away pretty quickly. So once you get to like age 25, age 26 and beyond, you don't really find those until you get to like age 50 plus, then you'll start finding them again. Yeah, again, they tend to be autistics from very conservative backgrounds. When it comes to women in non-ordained ministries, so things like women leading book studies, doing apologetics, sharing testimonies, leading theology seminars, preaching like to in non-ordained contexts, sharing a message at a youth retreat, or doing campus ministry or something like that. Typically, there's high support across the gender and sex spectrum. There is less support amongst more socially conservative groups and amongst older people, but that's pretty much the only times that you get people who have any sort of exceptions to that. The only real places where this changes is when you get to very conservative groups that just don't believe women should be in any leadership positions. And if you have an autistic person coming from one of those groups, they're less likely to support women being in those groups. But again, generally speaking, it is rare. There are some other arguments that I just thought I'd throw in here for these various positions that I thought I'd include, not because they're super common, but because I think they're kind of funny. So I didn't want to include these in the main ones so that you wouldn't get confused by thinking lots of autistic people hold these. But these are opinions I have heard spoken from the mouths of autistic people, particularly autistic women. And so this argument goes as follows. So the question is, should women be allowed in leadership roles? And again, recognize that autistic people are often very meritocratic when thinking about leadership and leadership roles. And the argument will go something like this. In theory, men should be allowed to be, or in theory, men should be allowed to hold leadership positions. However, we've been running this experiment for the last 2,000 years. And what has this experiment showed us from the last 2,000 years? It has shown us that men will routinely sexually abuse their parishioners. They will overlook sexual abuse. They will perpetuate great injustices, and they will cosmically screw up. And oftentimes, these women will point to recent church sex scandals and recent failures of the church to address sexual abuse and point out, do you notice a trend in these? Men. All men are the ones doing the abuse, men are the ones covering up the abuse, men are the ones hiding the abuse. And so their argument is, look, I believe that leadership should be determined by merit, and men have clearly shown us that they are incapable of holding leadership positions without sexually abusing people. And while it's not all men that do this, it's almost exclusively men that do this. So we should not allow men to be in leadership positions. And if we're not allowing men to be in leadership positions, we have to have someone in leadership positions. So obviously, that should be women.
It's
So
really
when you ask them, do you think only women should be leaders? They're like, no, but I don't think men should be allowed to unless they pass some very rigorous screening. So we should and like there should be checks and safeguards, and the only real way to prevent men from being abusive is if you give women who care about abused women power over them in some way to either countervene or to launch investigations or to do various things. And they will often point out that when it comes to fighting sexual assault and sexual abuse within the church, it is often women that are spearheading those initiatives. It is often women who are fighting those fights. If you look at the Church 2 movement, the hashtag Church 2, it is almost all women who are the ones manning the hashtag and doing the activism and being involved in the work. And so they will point out that if we're going by meritocracy, we should take seriously the fact that men have shown pretty consistently that they do not have the capability and function to be able to do this. And so, yeah, that's
Had their chance. Yeah.
it is certainly an argument. It is not an argument I often hear, but it is an argument that I have heard from a particular type of woman. But yeah, that's just another argument that I thought I'd throw in there, mostly because I find the reasoning very autistic. And like, when you look at it, it's okay, your logic is very sound here. I understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to optimize for. However, most Christians would probably not be willing to follow you down this hill. But yeah, so that's that's another argument that I have heard on occasion, which I have never heard from a non-autistic person. Moving on to a slightly more controversial topic
Oh
from
yeah.
women's ordination. Actually, I should, before we go on, do you have any questions about any positions on women's ordination that I didn't cover or that you think the good people of this podcast will be interested in hearing?
No, we're good.
Okay,
We talked about
cool.
theology of the body, so I'm good.
Moving on to abortion.
Yay.
So, yeah, this one obviously a little controversial. Many opinions on this. Remember, we hold whatever position you hold, so please don't email me saying you're wrong
Yes.
about this. I
No
hold
hate
your position.
mail because John
Yes.
thinks you're right.
Yep. I am merely reporting on the attitudes that people have. I'm
This
not
is what
saying that
people
any
say.
of these are good or any of these are bad. I am saying these are the things that are. So, abortion. Before I start talking about trends, I'm just going to sketch out the 4 positions that autistic people usually take. So, when it comes to abortion, there are 4 positions that you will hear from most autistic people if you ask them the question, what are your thoughts on abortion? And the positions are as follows. So, you got pro life, which I feel like I don't need to explain, pro choice, which I feel like I don't need to explain, I don't know, it's all very complicated, and then a 4th position. 4th position takes a little longer to explain. It is what I call abortion for thee, but not for me. So, what this position entails is it is a belief that abortion is murder, or if it's not murder, it's certainly a very morally wrong act. You know, maybe they won't say it's murder, but it's a very bad thing and you shouldn't do it. They believe that Christians should not do it, and if you do it, you have sinned. They believe that while it is a sin, we should not make any attempts to make it illegal at the state level. They will typically support interventions, but they will support non governmental interventions. So they will believe that we should have social support services that make it so that having a child doesn't mean your life is going to end. Or if they do believe in government programs to end abortion, they believe that it should go into a sort of whole of life care approach where you are against, or the way that you think that abortion should be dealt with is at the government should provide incentives and incentive structures that make it so that abortions would be rare because you just wouldn't want to have an abortion. They will often believe that it should still be legal and people should still have access to it, but Christians should not access it. And they will often have a very whole of life care ethic. So they are not just focused on abortion, they are often focused on a whole other host of things. So this position can be summarized by it should be legal, but Christians should not do it. And if you do it, you have done something wrong. Like very wrong is usually their positions.
Wow, what an interesting, unusual, and nuanced position.
Yes,
Thanks for
yes.
explaining that one, John.
You know, we can turn the sass down like 3 notches. I'm joking. You can keep the sass. You can keep the sass at whatever level you feel appropriate. So,
Aw.
abortion and opinions on abortion are heavily contingent on political affiliation, at least in North America. It changes a lot in Europe for autistic people. Opinions on abortion are heavily contingent on sex. And what I mean by this is that autistic males will often hold the I don't know, it's all very complicated position. And when you push them on it, they'll be like, I haven't really thought a whole lot about this. Or like, maybe, I can see. And they'll be wishy washy and they'll be willing to concede and they'll be much more willing to be conciliatory and find a middle ground, and often being like, it's all very complicated. Autistic women, however, complete opposite, just extremely strong opinions. You never get a wishy-washy response from an autistic woman about abortion. They have thought about it and they have a position. Yes, yeah, yeah, don't worry, they'll tell you. They will often tell you unprompted without you asking, whereas autistic men often will not. There is also another significant effect on the opinions of autistic women once they get pregnant and once they have children. Getting pregnant often changes an autistic woman's view on these issues.
Now, people
So,
say that happens with everyone, though.
yes,
There's always the like,
this is
oh, as soon as you get
this is not
pregnant.
unique to autistic women, but a lot of people seem to assume that when you get pregnant, your thoughts on abortion become more complicated. So you might go from a pro choice position to being like, ooh, there's a life inside of me. This is very important. Maybe I'm less in support of abortion. But typically, the effect that I've witnessed with autistic women is that once they get pregnant, they shift the other way. So they will usually go from very strict pro life to abortion for thee, but not for me, where they will say, okay, I kind of understand a lot more why women get abortions. I don't particularly love the changes that are happening to my body. This is all very scary. It is not a fun time in general. I get why women don't want to go through this. I completely understand why there are women who would want to seek out an abortion. I don't know if the state should be restricting access to this. While I would never do it, and while I would never endorse anyone do this, and while I would never tell anyone to do this, I kind of get it. And I feel a lot more sympathy with women who have gotten an abortion. And it's mostly because they get pregnant and they realize what pregnancy and what all the feelings around pregnancy and potential motherhood are. And that often changes things.
Yes.
I have not noticed it significantly change the other way, where they go from a completely pro choice to being like, maybe I should be pro life. You typically don't find that. What you typically find
With
is once they
autistic
get
women?
pregnant. Sorry?
With autistic women? Or
Yeah,
just,
with autistic
yeah.
women specifically. So with autistic women, I typically don't see them go from pro choice to pro life or from pro choice to abortion for thee, but not for me. But you often see them going from like e- extremely pro life to abortion for thee but not for me, and often they'll also be quite quiet about the fact that they've made that shift, and they'll often only tell you in private where they're like, this is not great. So I do know a lot of autistic women, and I do know a lot of autistic women get pregnant, and then a lot of those autistic women will be like, ooh, this is not my favorite thing. And then they know I have lots of information about autistic women, and they'll be like, have any other autistic pregnant women gone through these types of changes? And that's when they'll usually tell me their opinions are shifting on things, because they're realizing that being autistic and being pregnant may have some additional complications they had not initially thought of.
Yeah. That's how I ended up on this podcast, by the way.
Yeah, that is how she ended up on this podcast. Yeah, so you can thank Maddie's pregnancy for her excellent co-hosting.
Yes. And if you're out there and he just described you, you're not the only one. There's
Yes.
dozens of us.
Yes, it is fairly common for autistic women to not be super enthused about pregnancy
Yeah,
or
so don't
really
feel bad
early
about that.
childcare. What?
So don't feel bad about that if that's you.
Yes. There are also autistic women whose like special interest is pregnancy, and they love it. And they're very rare though. But those women do exist. I know women who have saved all of their placentas for various activities and are really into that type of thing.
I
Anyway,
envy them, honestly.
yeah. Whenever I tell an autistic woman about that, they're like, "I wish pregnancy could be my special interest. That would make my life so much easier right now."
That it would.
Yep, fair enough. Fair enough. So I think it's easier to start off by talking about autistic men, mostly because they're the easiest group to talk about. The exact numbers are really hard to get for men because often autistic men, do not speak about abortion unless explicitly prompted. So typically, autistic men have no visceral fear of pregnancy, and so they don't really have a strong
Weird.
opinion on this. They do not have to consider the fact that one day they may become pregnant, so they don't really think about whether or not they would get an abortion. It's not really something that often crosses their mind. They're too busy thinking about much more important things, like whether or not the Council of Chalcedon was valid in their condemnation of the Miaphysites, not these unimportant things like pregnancy. So the the opinions of autistic men will often shift from exclusively pro-choice to one of the other options after becoming a parent. So once they become a parent, they'll go, "Ooh, I didn't think about this as much as I probably should have, but I like my child." is often the case. So autistic men you will see move from pro-choice to the other positions.
That's pretty funny.
Yep.
Did they?
Self-identified conservative. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. How many men have the like abortion for thee but not for me thing?
It depends. So it's around 60%, but often they are way more wishy-washy around it.
Okay.
So if you are an autistic man and you're self-identified as conservative, with very few exceptions, you are very exclusively pro-life and very anti-abortion,
Right.
with very little sympathy for other pregnant women and very little sympathy for pregnant women who choose to get an abortion. So
Yeah.
if you look at high profile cases in which a woman gets an abortion, the autistic men from these conservative spaces are usually ones who strongly advocate for punitive measures against women who get abortions
Yeah.
and are very clear in terms of certainty how a woman should be treated if she gets an abortion, what the state's positions should be around that, typically if they're conservative men. But they'll typically not share those positions with you unless you explicitly ask or a situation comes up in which it's demanded of them. For autistics who aren't conservative, around 60% of them are in the for thee but not for me category. So if they're not conservatives, they're like, it's bad, but like it should be legal and you should have access to it. And the reason that they'll often say it's bad, but it should be legal and you should have access to it is often when you ask them why, they will give you a variety of different ideas, but the most common one you'll get is something in line with a violinist thought experiment. So, for those who aren't aware of the violinist thought experiment, it is an idea proposed where, hypothetically, say for the sake of argument, you were to wake up tomorrow and a evil scientist has hooked you up to a world famous violinist and says, "Don't worry, he is on life support using your body. There's nothing you can do, but just wait here for 9 months. Don't worry about it. If you just wait here for 9 months, he will live and he will survive, and then we can unhook you from the life support. Your body's going to go through lots of changes. You're going to feel all this stuff. But, if you disconnect the life support, this guy's going to die. And the violinist thought experiment is to say, look, you can believe that disconnecting the life support means it's murder, but should the government be allowed to tell you that you aren't allowed to disconnect the life support? Or do you have ultimate authority to decide who gets to use your body for life support or not? So that's the violinist thought experiment. Typically, when you're talking to autistic men and they are in the for thee but not for me category, and you ask why, they will often say something like that is equivalent to the violinist thought experiment. The other one is to basically be like, I mean, I think it should be legal. And then you ask, why do you think it should be legal? And they're like, I just kind of think it should be. And there's I haven't really thought about this too deeply. It sounds like the right thing. They tend to be quite conciliatory and add lots of caveats when they talk. And they are often really uncomfortable making very hard pronunciations. So if you ask them, okay, but is it murder? They'll be like, well, what is murder? Is it murder, or is it really bad? Like, maybe there's a line in which it becomes murder,
But
and
what
like
do you
maybe the
mean by
intentions
murder?
matter. So is it murder if you have an abortion because it was a girl and you wanted a boy, or vice versa? They would say, I don't know if it's murder, but that's highly immoral, and I wouldn't suggest anyone does it. Or in that case, it would be murder. But if you did it for life of the mother, it wouldn't be murder, or something like that.
Mm.
If they're not conservative, around 20% will be explicitly pro-life, just across the board, full pro-life position. And then the remaining 20% of those will be explicitly pro-choice, like just across the board pro-choice. Often they'll have some time-gated restrictions, so they'll say, I'm pro-choice up to 28 weeks or whatever, or like past the point of viability or something like that. And the remaining autistic people are in the, I don't know, it's all very complicated and I don't really know what to think. I'll just let the women decide this one. I'm sitting this one out. Someone please come get me. The thing with autistic men is they are usually not super opinionated about abortion, and they tend not to talk about it. So if you survey autistic Christian men and autistic Christian women about their positions on abortion, and just look at how many times abortion is mentioned in like a heat map, the woman heat map will be like bright red, and the man heat map will be small spatterings of some heat in some places. And so when compared to women, they are not nearly as vocal and often will not express their opinions. This is especially true if they are in conservative, or if they are not in conservative spaces. So if an autistic man is not in a conservative space, the chances that he will say anything about abortion is very low. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yep. However, we have autistic women. Now, autistic women get
Yay.
a lot more complicated. However, they are way easier to get data on because they talk about it a lot and they are very opinionated about abortion. So it is very rare to find an autistic woman who is, I haven't really thought about abortion that much, especially an autistic Christian woman. The general trend is they have thought about it and they have a position. And they are often tend to be quite polarized. So you will find them on the sort of far extremes of most camps. So they will have very strongly held positions and they will have very strongly held polarized positions.
Oh,
So in general, autistic women will have very strong opinions. They'll have very polarized opinions on these topics. So autistic Christian women are often the most vocal and most aggressive anti-abortion advocates. So if you look at anti-abortion advocacy, autistic women are the tip of the spear. They're the Marine Corps of the
Yeah,
anti-abortion advocacy. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, so they're the sharp end of the spear for sure when you just look at them talking about these issues. Autistic Christian women who are American and progressive tend to be pro choice. But if you don't meet one of those two categories, your opinions on it will differ. So, overall, the most frequent positions for conservative autistic women are as follows. So, the most frequent: no abortion, maybe abortion with extremely exceptional circumstances, like life of the mother or something like that. And often they will say, no abortion, exceptions for life of the mother, but not exceptions for my life. So they'll have a sort of attitude of, I understand why we should have legal protections for life of the mother, but if it's life of the mother with me, I'm going down with the ship. This is, it's coming out of me alive, even if I die, type of idea. And they'll often be very strong and very clear about that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they will say, you know, very rare circumstances. And so that's, of conservative women, that's around 70%. It's 69%. The next most common position is usually for thee, but not for me. They're usually quite quiet about this. They will usually not very vocally advocate for it, and they will often, like, their public advocacy will be, generally speaking, I'll say, a compassionate pro life, in that they will often say, like, I am anti abortion and I don't think abortion is a good thing, but they will tend not to focus on legal restriction, but they will focus on things like pregnancy crisis centers and things like that, where those are the center and the target of the advocacy. And they will be less like, we need to criminalize abortion and punish people who seek them out, and more, aren't babies nice? We should have more of them. And so they'll tend to be, if they are in this position, it's much harder to tell, but from what I have been able to tell, around 30% would hold the position that while it should be legal and while it should be accessible, it's morally wrong and you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
There
If
are
you're
some
really
very
nice to
rare
them.
examples.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and
Okay.
that's another big thing. Is typically these women are very emphatic that your position towards a woman who gets an abortion should be compassion and care for this woman. And I should be clear, even in the autistic women who are in the no abortion without any exceptional circumstances, they're usually quite compassionate towards women who have had abortions. It's
Yeah.
typically only the men that you'll find who aren't.
True.
Usually with women, they'll be like, "No, I understand it. I think you're wrong, and I don't think you should have been allowed to do that. But
Yeah. Hmm.
I get it. It's just bad." Like a sort of like, you've done something wrong and you've done something that should be illegal, and I don't condone it, but it's, yeah, autistic women are way more compassionate about women who do get abortions than autistic men.
The men are
There
the
are
ones
some,
who are like, it's murder, and so we should try and jail them like they are murderers because they are, and I can't understand why these women are being so nice to them.
yes, yes. So that's another thing. Autistic women will often fight with autistic men because autistic men don't think they're being pro-life enough, and autistic women are like, you are a man, you do not understand this.
Which is crazy because they basically own the movement.
Yes, yes. However, like I said, the finest warriors, the Navy SEALs in the abortion wars on the side of anti abortion, are autistic women. One of the things that I often point out, particularly to progressive audiences, is if you look for a woman praying a rosary outside an abortion clinic and then get their RADS R score, it's not dipping below 30. Now, does that mean that all of them are autistic? No, but like, I've talked to a lot of those women. I talked to a lot of autistic women who I asked, what are your daily spiritual practices and habits? And they're like, well, before I go to university, I go and I pray the rosary outside this abortion clinic, and then I go to class, and then on my way back, it's on the way, so might as well do it. Um, and often ones who will be very involved in these types of things. Often they are also Catholic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amongst progressive autistic Christian women, or sort of left liberal autistic Christian women, the most common position is abortion for thee, but not for me. So that's at around 55% of those women will be for thee, but not for me. They'll usually be pretty clear about that as well. So they will be clear that I think abortion should be legal, safe, and accessible, but I would not get one myself. That is the largest contingent of left, liberal, and progressive autistic women. The next most common is no abortion without extremely exceptional circumstances at around 25%. And they're often quite quiet about this, so it's really hard to nail down exact numbers, because if you are on the progressive left liberal side and you say, I think abortion should be illegal, or I think abortion is murder, it's not taken very well socially by people in these positions. Yeah. And then the remaining sort of 20% ish will be pro-choice. So the largest is I think it should be illegal, or sorry, the largest is I think it should be legal, but it's wrong and you shouldn't do it. The next largest is just pro-life, and then the smallest contingent are pro-choice. If you combine them all together for autistic conservative women, around almost all of them I'll re-say this, amongst progressive autistic women, around 80% of them will believe abortion should be legal and should be accessible. And only around 20% of them will think it should not be. So conservative women, it's around 70%, but of the remaining 30%, most will say, even though it should be legal, it is it is immoral and it is murder and you should not be allowed to do it. So for autistic women, a lot of factors for that play into opinions about abortion are things like the fear and the specter of pregnancy and motherhood. Often plays very heavily on autistic women's psyche in a way that it does not for men. So
Go
men,
figure.
you ask them, like, are you looking forward to being a parent? And they're like, I don't know, maybe. But for autistic women, there is often like a sense of, my body's going to change, my life is going to change, I'm going to have this thing that's attached to me, basically, not just for 9 months, but when it comes out, I'm going to be breastfeeding it for a while. And babies don't detach from their mothers super well. And this is all very scary. And my life's going to change, and my life's going to change pretty irreversibly, because if you have kids and you're a mother, in our society, you are the default carer. And because of this fear, a lot of autistic women will see, who are in the for thee but not for me camp, will like fully understand why other women get abortions. They will see it as a sort of necessary evil or escape hatch, and they will often not endorse it for themselves, but they'll say, look, while I'm willing to go down with a ship, I think it's completely rational for a woman to not want to go down with a ship. And there should be things that you should be allowed to do, even though they're wrong. An example that I have heard before by women who I used to work with who were religious. So they're from the military. They're just, so you're like, John, why are you talking? Women aren't giving war analogies. They are in this case because they are in the military. So often the position they'll say is like, okay, so imagine you're conscripted to go to war and you believe the war is unjust and you kill an enemy soldier in that war. The war does not fit the Christian criteria for just war. It is not a moral war that you should be fighting, but you are conscripted and you go to war and you kill an enemy in that war. you need to go to confession. Like, you need to pray to God for forgiveness of the sins that you have committed. But also, I understand why you would do that, and I don't think you should be tried for murder for killing someone in an unjust war type of thing. And so the attitude is that, essentially, that what you've done is wrong, but I don't think it should be illegal. There are instances in which I understand why you might want to make it illegal, but the logistics of it are not something I would want to ever endorse, type of thing. Yeah, like I said, a lot of autistic women will shift their positions from being explicitly pro life to abortion for thee, but not for me. Rarely do they shift to fully pro choice, very rarely, but usually what happens is the autistic woman goes through pregnancy, doesn't have a great time with pregnancy, and adjusting to all the sort of permanent changes in her life, and has a very visceral feeling of why someone might get an abortion, and goes, I get it. This makes sense.
Yeah.
Don't super love it, but, you know, if I wasn't a Christian and if I didn't hold so closely to the beliefs that I hold, I could see why I might want to pull the escape pin here. They'll often believe it's wrong, but often be very sympathetic. And again, very common thing for autistic women on both sides is to have a high level of sympathy for women who do get abortions, and a lot of understanding and compassion that you definitely don't see from autistic men who do not support abortion. And often the ones who are pro life are also pro whole of life, so they would often support, basically, if they are pro life and ardently pro life, they also would typically support extended maternity leave for mothers, or paid maternity leave, or other pro family policies that would basically allow the husband to take more time off work so that they can spend time with the woman right after she's pregnant. I want to be really clear, these are not like culture warrior pro life people. They a lot of times especially in more left liberal progressive spaces, they are like, if you're pro abortion, why aren't you, or if you're anti abortion, then
Spiritual.
you need to care for the child, not just when it's in the womb. And these autistic women are like, yes,
We
let's do
agree.
that. We agree with you. And so oftentimes, a lot of those arguments don't really work for those autistic women.
Yeah. A lot of culture war stuff kind of just goes out the window when it's autistic people.
Yes, that is in general true. Why do autistic people hold these positions? All the reasons we've already talked about, but when it comes down to it, the biggest reason that autistic women hold to a pro-life position is, or a for thee but not for me position, is because they believe abortion is murder. Mostly
Mhm.
because this is pretty consistent teaching of the church throughout all of its history.
True. Yeah.
Now, I know when I say that, people are going to be like, it's more complicated, and it is, and we'll get to that. But autistic women who are pro life or abortion for thee but not for me will say the reason they hold this position is that the Christian position is pro life, and that there isn't really room for Christians to consider abortion as anything other than murder. They will cite various texts. So the Bible itself doesn't talk about abortion, but many early Christian texts, like the Didache, explicitly say abortion is murder. They will also talk about like infant exposure and abortion in the same breath.
Hmm.
Other letters, like the Epistle to Diognetus, virtually every church father, yeah, they all talk about these things. Now, many people will say, actually, it's a lot more complicated because various church fathers and various doctors of the church throughout time, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, did not hold that life began at conception. And so abortion could be permissible for things before the quickening or whatever. And
The
you will
quickening.
typically get arguments like that, especially from pro-choice activists who will say things like, look, the church's teachings on this, like they do say abortion is wrong, granted, but when is it abortion is the question they'll ask. And usually the response from these autistic women is to say something like the following. Number one, I don't care what Thomas Aquinas had to say about the quickening. Is typically the type of thing that they'll say.
Right.
The next thing they'll typically say is the church fathers and the doctors of the church did not really understand sexual reproduction in the way that we now understand sexual reproduction. So a lot of them didn't know about the sort of the gamete zygote model, where two gametes come together to form a zygote. So the large gamete is the female, the small gamete is the male, or like sperm and egg, and
Hmm.
they fuse together to create a zygote, and then that zygote starts to multiply. And so they will say life begins at conception because life begins at that unifying point. And had the church fathers known about this, or had Thomas Aquinas known about this, they would have also agreed with the position, because that's when cell replication starts to like sort of kick off the chain. And
Right.
you will often hear them say something like, you are using 12th century medical science and 12th century medical knowledge to make your position about abortion. I'm using modern medical science and modern medical knowledge to make my position on abortion. Which do you think is the better one to choose? Like, they thought bloodletting back then was good for you. And sure, it might be good for some disorders, but like in general, we should go with modern understandings. And they will say, in a modern understanding, I believe that life begins when the cells start to divide and replicate. So I don't really care about the quickening or any of these other ideas about fetus development in the 12th century. I care about how it actually happens in reality. So that's typically the response you'll get. Morally, again, these people will often just think, look, life has to begin at some point. The best point is to basically say conception, because if you pick any other arbitrary point, it's very hard to tell, well, is this a life and is this not a life? Or is
Right.
it's a life here, but it's not there? And they will often have this moral intuition that tells them, we don't know when exactly life does start. And if we don't know, we should go to the earliest point where it could start. Because if you don't know, the best thing to do is to go to the safest option. Because if you
Right.
go with the safest option, you definitely know you're not murdering anything. If you don't go with a safe option, you might be murdering something. And so this is like that 1% principle, where
Hmm.
they believe abortion genuinely is murder. And if you're not 100% sure that at this point it's murder, you should just back all the way up to the earliest point where it's not murder. And so they'll usually reason that way and say, that's what it is. And, God does not approve of the elective ending of a life, especially an innocent life. And a fetus, therefore, they'll either say it's a life or it's likely a life, and we don't know when it becomes one. So we're defaulting to the option where we definitely know it doesn't happen before this, but it could happen after this. So earliest point, that's the position. And so this is sort of how they talk about it. These are where they go with that. The biggest differences that you'll find in autistic women is how they believe the government should be oriented towards this. So, do you think the government should be able to tell you you cannot get an abortion? Is the biggest basic dividing line. When it comes to pro life positions, they basically just say, yeah, you should, because it's murder. And when you get to the position of for thee but not for me, they will say, while it is murder, the government should not be allowed to regulate this. And they will often give reasons of bodily autonomy or reasons related to that, where they will say either bodily autonomy or I understand why a woman who doesn't have my moral convictions would want to go ahead with these types of things. And I don't think my moral intuitions should be the ones that dictate how the government should act. because we live in a pluralist society, and in a pluralist society, we do have to consider that other people don't see things with my exact moral framing. And so I will have to concede this here legally because I don't think, for whatever reason, that this is a battle worth fighting. On this plane, maybe we can fight it on something else. And so that's basically the biggest dividing line that you'll typically get, is what the government should do about it. Yeah. Generally speaking, the moral and hermeneutic justifications stay exactly the same between pro-life and pro-choice. Or, sorry, between pro-life and for thee but not for me. The biggest deviation is when it gets to pro-choice. So for pro-choice people, they will often give the examples of why it should be legal that you would sometimes find with the for thee but not for me crowd, but they will often also be really adamant about various things, like they will say life does not begin until this point. So before that point, it's
Quickening.
not murder. Or they will say something like abortion, even if it is murder, a woman's right to bodily autonomy is necessary for a woman to be free in our society. Therefore, it is a necessary right for all women. So, you may be wondering, how do these people hermeneutically justify their positions?
What on earth could be a
Yes.
hermeneutic justification for this?
So, typically, when you ask them, like, all right, so the church has been pretty clear on this, they will say a few things. One of the things they will say is the church is not clear on this. They will say that there is actually quite a bit of moral ambiguity, and there is a lot of differing opinions, and it is
Right.
fine for Christians to hold variations of these differing opinions. And if there are differing opinions, that means there's room for argumentation, and this isn't a settled matter. And so if it's not a settled matter and there is ambiguity in this, these are the types of positions you're allowed to take, and you are allowed to argue about these. You will often get arguments that not only does life begin, or life not begin at conception, life begins at another point, so abortion before that is fine. You'll often get arguments about, well, the goal of Christianity is to fully embrace your humanity and things like that. And so you'll get arguments about abortion sometimes being the best and the most loving thing to do in cases of poverty or in cases of, desperation and things like that. And this can fit within a Christian ethic of love. Now, again, before you start sending me angry emails about this, I hold whatever position you hold. I'm not describing my own position. I'm describing other people's positions that they describe to me. So, often you will get people discussing various church fathers and when they think life actually begins. And there will also be another argument about needing to bring ancient practices in line with modernity. A very common position that you will hear from a certain type of autistic woman is another argument. And the argument basically goes like this. Yes, Christians have banned abortion. And Christians have banned abortion for good reasons. Because when Christians when Christians started, access to abortion was actually very dangerous. And if you're performing an abortion in ancient Rome, there's no guarantee that the mother's going to live through this. And abortion was not something that a woman chose for herself, because the baby is the man's choice. Under the paterfamilialis, a woman doesn't get to decide whether or not she keeps the fetus inside her. This is a decision made by the man in charge of her. So this is either imposed by a father in the case of an illegitimate child. A woman gets pregnant by another man. The father forces her to get an abortion because she's not married to that man, or that man is from a different social class. Oftentimes prostitutes would get abortions because they just couldn't have the baby in order to do their job or whatever. And so they will often point out that abortion was never a woman's choice at the time that Christian ethics were developing. And so when Christians looked at abortion and the way it was practiced in antiquity, of course they would go, this is bad, this is wrong, because it is bad and it is wrong. And especially the way that they're doing it in a sort of patriarchal dominated society in which this bad thing is being imposed on women who often don't want it imposed on them and who have no choice in the matter. Yeah, Christians should oppose that because that's a really bad thing. And they
Right.
will often point that when you look at first wave feminist movements, for example, I often find this one very funny. So, do you know who Mary Wollstonecraft is?
I've heard the name.
So, she is talked about like a sort of proto feminist. And it's really funny because people like visit her grave and put like pro choice stickers on her grave.
Yeah.
She was ardently opposed to abortion. And she was
Yeah.
ardently opposed to abortion, and a lot of early feminists were, because
Right.
again, early feminists did not see abortion as a woman's choice because it wasn't really up to a woman in those societies. It was up to the man, and it was often imposed on the woman against her desires. And so,
Yes.
what Christians were doing is basically saying, we're taking this choice away from men. Like, men are not allowed to impose on women's bodies in this way. And the principle that Christian ethics is trying to put forward is a principle that cares and protects for women in their vulnerable state, particularly against men. And so, what we need to understand is this is what the anti-abortion restrictions from Christians were. They were these attempts to stop male imposition on the female body. Now that we are in modern times and we have access to modern medicine and modern abortion practices, a woman is not being forced to do it by a man, and a woman is electing by her own free choice to go through a safe medical procedure. That is a different issue than what the Christians were opposing.
Hmm.
And so they will say that the reason I am pro choice is because I would oppose the same form of abortion that other Christians were opposing. But what I am opposing is not the form of abortion, or what I am supporting is not the form of abortion that I think Christians were opposing.
Right.
And
Okay.
and so that is typically the argument that you will get from them. They are typically very well read on feminist history and women's history, and they are typically very well informed on that. And
Mm.
yeah, that is, you don't get that argument from many women. You will typically get that from autistic women who have a very specific interest in women's history and things like that, who are also pro choice. I should mention, again, pro choice is not the majority. A lot of autistic women will know all those things and say all those things and say, and that's why I'm still anti abortion, because
Right.
I'm following in the footsteps of Wollstonecraft and like the suffragettes who opposed abortion as well for various reasons. So, yeah, again, don't email me telling me I'm wrong. I hold your position. um,
Yeah. No hate mail. Not
yes,
from
I
this
keep
one.
saying this because people do send me a lot of emails telling me how could you hold this position when all I'm trying to say is, look, these are the positions that people hold. With that being said, that is all I really have to say about the issues of women's ordination and abortion when it comes to
Yay.
autistic people and autistic attitude. Do you have any questions that I didn't answer, or anything that
Any
you want?
comments? Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess the only thing is just that it's interesting that, I don't know, like people aren't going to like it, but it's the same impulse that makes the autistic women rapidly pro life as it does make them rapidly pro choice.
Yes. Yep. It is the exact same thing that makes you pro life, makes you pro choice in both directions. And so I don't know, it's just a very autistic woman thing to fixate on, especially for Christians, because it's often a very big deal for Christians. And
Right.
so yeah, and just autistic men, as you will probably find as we talk more and more about this type
I
of things, are just
don't know.
generally less engaged on issues about gender.
No idea
Um,
what's going on. Living off in their own
yeah,
little world.
just doing their own thing. dudes being guys. Yeah, so that's all I have to say for this episode. Next episode, we are going to talk specifically about autistic attitudes towards gender roles and feminism. And finally, as many people have been requesting, autistic attitudes towards trans issues. That's the next episode. Again, reminding you,
That's
don't
the big
send me
one.
hate mail.
Come back for that. That'll be a
Yeah,
big
yeah. I understand that many of the things that I have said during this podcast, people will disagree with. And that's because people hold widely different views. I'm not trying to justify them. I'm trying to explain what they are and to give you the sort of lay of the land.
It's a
If you
public
want to
service.
contact, yes, yes. Think of me as an intelligence officer briefing you on a warring conflict in a nation you are not part of, and you're just interested in figuring out why the various factions are fighting. Think of me
Yes.
like that, not as a member of one of these factions that are fighting. So if you'd like to contact me to not send me hate mail, you can send me an email at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can tweet me at christianityon, or you can find me at Blue Sky at the same Christianity on. If you would like to find Maddie, you can find her at
I'm Bronzor on Twitter at Fickle Frontier. Be nice to me.
there you go. Also, actually direct all your hate specifically towards Bronzor. She, yeah,
True, yeah.
Maddie is currently like, if there's one thing that I want in my life right now, it's for people to be really mad at me because I am in a emotionally strong position where my feelings are not constantly changing with the whims of whatever hormone cycle I'm currently on due to a second trimester pregnancy.
If you're mean to me, I'll cry
Yeah,
because I'm
if
pregnant.
yeah, if you're going to be mean to us, you have to be mean to Maddie, and she's pregnant, and so you'll be being mean to a pregnant woman, and so
Yeah.
yeah, don't do that. Anyway, that ending got a little bit away from us, but that's it. See you later.
Bye.